Okay, so it's time. All right, so welcome to the last installment of German 59. So I think I feel like we've been on a bit of a journey this quarter. Hopefully it's been one that's been productive for you, enlightening, certainly I'm sure disturbing, but also I think hopefully at times inspiring. And the lecture today will be, I don't know how long it'll go. I have some memorials I want to talk about, and then I have some kind of broader reflections that I want to provide. And I'll begin by just saying a couple words about the final, in case you weren't here last time, or in case you harbor anxieties that we want to address. Just a reminder, it is Tuesday in this room, 11:30 to 2:30. You have 3 hours, unless you have special accommodations to have additional time, in which case I know about it, and you have additional time. You should bring a blue book. You should bring pencils or pens. I'd prefer pens, ideally black ink, not like really weird colors because it's hard to read. Black or blue would be good. No books, no notes, no phones, no conversations. The exam will be proctored by the TAs. I'll be here at the beginning because I'm going to make sure that everyone gets settled in case you have any questions. I will also have a couple of film clips that I show people who are taking the exam here. A couple of you asked me about the film clips if you're taking the exam separately or some other place or a different time. You will not have those film clips in your exam, but you'll still have to talk about films. It'll just be, I'll tell you about the films. Let's see. In terms of the structure, it's just like I said before. It's a series of short answers, which are 1 paragraph long, and it's 3 essays that are about 2 pages each. And by 2 pages, I mean front and back. So not terribly long. The issue is that there are 11 questions on the exam and 1 extra credit. And so you have to pace yourself. Nothing is particularly tricky. Everything, I think, is very straightforward. But if you were to be particularly slow, you may not find that at the end you're done. I suspect the exam can be finished between 2 and 3 hours. But if you're very slow, you may find yourself stressed. So just, right. In terms of preparation, like I said before, it's comprehensive. It covers the whole quarter. It's only on the main topics, the main things, the main readings, the main things we looked at. You also have a fair amount of choice, I should say, about what you write about. So if I say, hey, write about some of the perpetrators, you think in your mind, who are some of the perpetrators we talked about, and you're ready to write about them. So my mode of preparation would be prepare yourself ahead of time for things like ways you can deploy your knowledge, because the questions are generally, at least the essay ones, are fairly open-ended. And so the best preparation that I can give, in addition to going through the PowerPoints and watching any lectures that you didn't watch, because you do want to make sure you watch the lectures, because I obviously provided information and interpretation. The other way to think about it, to prepare, would be to essentially prepare knowledge that you can deploy in answers about major things, like testimony, or perpetrators, or the history of genocide, or fascism, kind of the big topics, right? Anti-Semitism, these are the big topics of the class. So you would have knowledge that you can apply. I should also say that in anything that, except the films perhaps, but I think the films are so obvious, if I show you a clip, you're going to know. I mean, you only have 6 choices after all. And I've talked about them all. I will almost, with the exception of the film, I will always identify the work that you're talking about. So if I say talk about a poem, I'm going to give you the poem, and I'm going to tell you who wrote it. So you don't have to know that. But you do have to know how to interpret it. Okay? So the same thing goes for like a document. If I'm not going to ask you to identify some random document, I'm going to say, here's who wrote it. This is when it was written. And then you're asked to say something, interpretive about it. So again, that's how I would study for the exam. That's the kind of questions I'm asking you. It's not meant to trick you or find some kind of obscure fact. There's nothing obscure about the exam. Questions?
What did you say last lecture about being able to skip?
Yeah, you have a choice in both cases. So 3 out of 4 essay answers or 8 out of 9 short answers. So you basically can skip one essay question and you can skip one of the other short answer questions. The other short answer question is actually extra credit. So if you answer them all, whatever one you decide is your extra credit one. You don't have to do the extra credit. So extra credit gets you 105 points maximum on the exam. If you answer just all the 8 short answers and the 3 essays, it's 100 points maximum. With extra credit, 105. It's not graded on a scale. It's just absolute numbers. Anyone, you can all get 105. I'd be very happy. I'd give everyone an A+. It's not a scale, not a curve. All right?
So is the extra credit question the extra essay question?
No, the extra short answer. Yeah. The essay questions, you would pick one that you don't answer at all. Again, they're pretty broad. So like, you can, you think about like, what do you feel most comfortable writing about? And in that regard, there's a lot of right answers often. It's just the content has to be correct. But they say one person can write one essay, another person can write another essay because they just chose different examples, and they both get maximum credit. Okay?
Do we have specific grades for cut-off grades for each letter?
Yeah, 90, 80, 70, like that. Yeah, so 90 and above, I don't know, 90 to 92 is like an A-, 93 or whatever is an A. We're going to give you a number. So everything is quantified at the end. Yeah. You get up to 105 points. Yeah. All right, let's move on. I mean, I think, in some ways I would say, like, yes, you should be concerned in the sense that, you should know this stuff. But in a sense, you don't have to be concerned at all, because if you've been here, and many of you have been, and you're completely present, and you've been, keeping up, you're going to do just fine. Okay? Yeah. So, we got some stuff on board for today. I'm going to talk, it's actually, 3 memorials in Berlin, and one that's not in Berlin, but actually is a Dutch memorial that I'm going to talk about. So these are the memorials I'm going to talk about today, and they're really interesting in a lot of regards because I think they ask some kind of meta questions for the class concerning questions of memory and history, and also the particular built form that these memorials take, and the way in which they engage a public. So particularly a public who is being asked in some ways to remember something that they may not have any memory of in a direct sense, right? They didn't actually go through it. So it's like you and me, we're being asked in some ways to remember the Holocaust, and yet we're not survivors. We don't have experiential knowledge, right? And this is really interesting because this is kind of the challenge of building memorials and monuments and museums. You're not just building them for the survivors or the victims, you're building them in many ways for the future. And in that regard, they have to speak to a future that's going to be, by definition, distant from the events themselves. Distant, linguistically, culturally, religiously, temporally, and probably spatially. And so, how these memorials kind of navigate that distance is really an interesting question for me. And, I think also potentially for you. So I had showed you this memorial, actually, I think a couple weeks ago. And I wanted to come back to it because I think it's very significant in a number of ways. And in some ways, we have kind of sort of a summary of knowledge. Like, we've gone through the whole class. We understand now what the Holocaust was. We understand what had happened. And a couple of things that are significant about this memorial that I wanted to speak about, just in terms of its sort of spatial layout. One is, immediately you can see the size of it. I mean, it's bigger than many buildings, right? You see, like, these are buildings on the side here, apartment buildings, stores, and so forth. These are cars. This is a memorial that's meant to really be grand. It's big. This space was actually allocated all the way back in 1992 by Helmut Kohl. And at the time, what was really interesting about this location is that there used to be right here a wall, the Berlin Wall. It used to run right here. It ran this is the Reichstag building. The Brandenburg Gate is right here, a very famous gateway. A very famous street runs right back here called Unter den Linden. which means under the linden trees. It's Berlin's kind of major avenue. It's like the Champs-Élysées of Berlin. And straight through this area used to be the Berlin Wall. It was there for almost 30 years. Beyond the Berlin Wall, what you had were surveillance stations. You had watchtowers, you had guard dogs, you had, things on the ground to prohibit people from moving. This side over here, this is the east. This side over here, this is the west. So technically the memorial is in East Berlin. This would have been the eastern part of Berlin. And in 1992, Germany had just become reunified 2 years earlier. Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Germany, East Germany, West Germany comes back together in 1990. Helmut Kohl authorizes all of this land, very valuable land, in the very center of Berlin, just south of the Reichstag, for a Holocaust memorial. Now that's very significant. And again, I say this because, again, I think about, what memorials, do we have locally and in Washington, D.C., on our national mall? And of course, there's a lot of them. There's war memorials, there's memorials to, great presidents, there's now the MLK Memorial, there's memorials to the Korean War, to the Vietnam War. The Holocaust Museum is nearby, not directly on the mall. What memorials or people speak most, to the national needs of a country? And it's interesting that the Holocaust would speak, so to speak, so centrally, not just to the needs, so to speak, of Germany, but also in some ways the coming to terms with the past, right? This question of an honest confrontation with the significance of the crimes, and to do so in a built environment. And not just any built environment, but an experiential built environment. Because we talked about the significance of this memorial, which is you're supposed to enter into it, like you go inside of it. So I gave you kind of like the topography, a kind of top view. And what you see here is obviously a very large, kind of wave-like formation. The different sizes of these 2,700 concrete columns, all of which are just slightly leaning. So not only is the ground slightly leaning, and I actually had a chance to talk to the architect a number of times about this memorial. He told me that every single column leans like 1 to 2 degrees as well, on purpose, because it's, again, meant to create this effect of disequilibrium, of instability, of vertigo, of dizziness, right? I'm meant to have an experiential effect on someone who enters into it as they descend into the memorial deeper and deeper, and losing one's way, being disoriented, is the effect. Now, it's interesting, this memorial doesn't name any victims. It doesn't actually name perpetrators. It doesn't actually take a figurative form. The human body is not figuratively represented. You think of that hand that I showed you, the memorial in Miami Beach, with writhing bodies and contorted faces and mothers with children. In many ways, this to us, shows human pain. This memorial doesn't necessarily show human pain in the same way. It doesn't necessarily show suffering in the same way, but it does have a different effect, which is it produces this sense of being sort of uneasy, vertigo, right? And yet at the same time, and this is kind of, I think, an interesting thing about this memorial, if you do a Google search online for images of this memorial, you'll see people having picnics on top of these things. You'll see people skateboarding on it. You'll see people taking selfies with it with their friends. You'll see people probably on dates, people doing all kinds of things in this memorial. I also asked Peter Eisenman about that. I was like, what do you think about the fact that people are using it in ways that are not particularly maybe sacrosanct? And his point was that not only can you not control how people are going to use it, you must not do that. Because the idea is the memorial is going to kind of signify and speak to different generations in different ways. And people, sure, will behave in different ways, some of which we may take issue with. But the point is, a memorial is something that moves through time. And therefore, our relationship to it is going to change. He said, if I was going to prescribe a way that you have to behave, you have to have your head down, you have to be sad, he said it would be ineffective. Because you basically be prescribing a way to interact with it. He said it's actually kind of open. You can interact with it in a lot of different ways. Some interactions I may not like, I may not sanction, but I can't prescribe them ahead of time, is what he said. And that I thought was a really interesting observation, and maybe one that was still a little unsettling, for me. So what does it look like in terms of, this is just an architectural drawing that he created before the memorial was put up. But the idea, you can kind of see by the arrangement of what are called the stelae, these columns, is that you kind of have a sense of the density increases as you enter into the memorial, as you get kind of into the thick of things. And from the section detail, you can also see as you get deeper and deeper, your body itself is enveloped because the columns, which again, slightly leaning, as you can see there, the columns begin to overwhelm you. You can't entirely see out. And in this regard, it has that effect again of vertigo. I wanted to show you this because before Eisenman won the competition for this memorial, there was another winner. This was the memorial that was supposed to be built in this place. At least supposed to be built insofar as it won the very first competition, because the way things work in Germany with regard to memorials, and they work this way to a certain extent in the United States. Maya Len, for example, won the competition at age 21 for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. She entered a competition. The jury judged this to be the best submission, and therefore it was built. Well, her memorial, as many of you know, has about 50,000 names inscribed on it. And those names are inscribed not alphabetically, but by year of death. And as you descend into that memorial, many of you know it gets bigger and bigger, and the number of dead line up. That was the inspiration for Christina Jakob Mark's memorial, which was to inscribe all the names of the known victims on this plate. Now, there were only about 4.5 million names that are known. There are another 1.5 or so that are unknown. Those are people that were probably primarily shot by Einsatzkommandos, where you don't have an accounting of who they were. But this, you can imagine, this creates a problem. 50,000 names is already overwhelming. 4.5 million names is staggering. How would you read them? You'd have to walk on the memorial. What logic would you use to alphabetize them? How do you alphabetize 4.5 million names, not to mention in about 30 different languages because of the scope? And the fact is that they would have to be tiny in order to fit that many on. They kind of did the math. If you had these names, they each were this size, and you have this amount of space, they'd almost have to be illegible in order to inscribe them. And so these were some of the practical reasons why this memorial was scrapped. These were meant to be kind of stone rocks that were in place in different parts. But for the most part, this was going to be inscribed with names. Again, it was scrapped simply because it was impractical to name all the victims on an inscription. So I'm going to show you another memorial. This is this is to me really interesting, and also one of the strangest memorials I've ever seen. This is a memorial to 100,000 Dutch Jews who were killed by the Nazis, and it's a digital monument. It only actually exists online. You have to log on. You go to www.joodsmonument.nl, and you come to this. At least this is the first version of it. They've actually updated it recently. And so I was fascinated. In 2005, this was unveiled. And this memorial recognizes the fact that when the Nazis were in the Netherlands, they deported about 2/3 of the Jews, and they were killed in concentration camps. And this memorial commemorates 100,000 people. So you say, how does it do this? This is a raster graphic, technically. It's a grid of pixels. Well, if you click on a little box, what happens is the little box makes a query to a database, and the database tells you who those little pixels represent. So this is the Nathan DeHaan and his family. Well, big blue lines are men, big red lines are women. These are adolescents, and these are children, okay? So basically, all these colors signify either boy or girl, and depending on how high the pixel box is, it tells you what age they were. Like they were adults, they were teenagers, or they were children. And then it gives you information about the family. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 family members, all killed here in Auschwitz in 1942. So this is, raises some interesting questions. One, you're like, whoa, there's no built monument. 2, is that really appropriate to, have a kind of computational pixels representing people's life experiences and a database? Yeah, Anne? All the Danish Jews were. These are Netherlands, Dutch Jews. Yeah, we're talking about the Netherlands. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, two different places. Yeah, Denmark was the Danish Jews, they were all saved. The Netherlands is what we're talking about here, and about 2/3 of 150,000 were killed. And these are the 2/3. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. I don't know if I misspoke. I'm sorry if I did.
In the middle, there's like a specific section which is blue.
This line, right? Yeah.
Means something like this specific line.
You know, I actually wondered that myself as well, and I don't know, because it also occurs in a couple different places. And I don't know exactly, other than these are primarily men, and they're primarily adults. And so I wonder why particular communities, and it may have been that particular communities had primarily adults. So like that, this blue and red part all the way across there basically means no children. And I don't know exactly why. But the order here, by the way, is by place of deportation. It's actually not by year, it's actually by place. So it starts with whatever A is in the Netherlands and goes all the way to Z. So that's the other kind of weird logic about this, is it's place of deportation in the Netherlands. So if you log on to this now, you actually don't see this. Sadly enough, this existed for almost 10 years, and I loved it in some ways, and I also kind of found it troubling in other ways. But they changed it recently, and I was really interested in this. They changed it to a very different interface. And the interface they decided to do was not use those little pixel bars anymore, but instead to use names. And it kind of speaks, again, to that whole question of, do we commemorate the names of the victims? And so when you go online now, it's actually a very interesting zoomable interface. You kind of zoom in, you zoom out. As you zoom out all the way, you see you really can't read the names because it's whatever size your computer screen is, right? But you get to 100,000 names. And so this is like pretty zoomed in. So like I'm zooming in like on a map, and obviously I can read the street names at some point. It's like I can read the names of the victims. And what you're seeing here is you now actually have some new ways to organize the material. You can search by time, you can search by, you can do other things like by place. And then when you click on the name, you're brought up with the same kind of database of information. Some of these have pictures now, and this is also new. But you could sort of imagine that what the critique is that was made of this version is that it was in some ways dehumanizing. It was quantitative. In some ways, you maybe could even say it maybe continued the logic of the perpetrators in some regard, and that in order to go back to this version, now names and faces and pictures, in some ways the intention was they decided we're going to try to humanize this monument in some ways. Now, I don't know if that's a fair critique. I mean, maybe. You could argue that. But I also found this graphic, which is such an interesting aesthetic image, so in some ways kind of overwhelming because you can almost see the sheer size. I mean, how do you visualize 100,000 people at once? And this graphic does that. It does it with some strange colors, but maybe it gives you a sense of the scale and the scope. This interface does that a little bit, the zoomability, but perhaps maybe not quite in the same way. So just a thought, an interesting kind of way of thinking about what a digital monument would look like. I'm going to show you two others. Kind of quickly, one of the most extraordinary buildings that I've ever been in, and if you go to Berlin, I encourage you to go, which is Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum, which is this structure here. So this zigzagging titanium and zinc plated building is a museum, a Jewish museum. And it's dedicated to the history of the Jews since the beginnings in Germany, which goes back to the 4th century along the Rhine, all the way to the present. And of course the Holocaust is part of it, but it's not the entire thing. It's not just a Holocaust museum. Next door to it is this building here, which pre-existed. It used to be a judiciary, it used to be a courthouse, but now it's a German history museum. And what's interesting about these two buildings, here's the front view. The German History Museum is here. The Jewish History Museum is very close by. You can walk in between these two buildings. There's actually enough space to walk there. It's about maybe, I don't remember, like 10 or 20 feet apart. But the idea is that on the surface, the German history and the Jewish history are separated. They're close, but they're separated. But the interesting thing about this structure is that in order to get into the Jewish museum, you have to go in the doors of the German History Museum. And as you go down, you take stairs, and then you walk across underground, and you pop up into the Jewish Museum. So symbolically, they're connected underground, right? So it's almost like they have a foundation that connects them together. On the surface, they appear to be apart, but underneath, they're connected. And in order to get to the Jewish history, you have to go through the German history. Now, you don't have to go through all the exhibitions in the German History Museum, but you do have to go through that shared entrance. And that itself is an interesting kind of symbolic gesture. It sort of says the two histories are connected in a deep and profound way, and yet they're also fractured. They're also separated from one another in other ways. And obviously, if you just think about the structure of the buildings, I mean, look, this is a kind of, it's symmetrical. It's it's obviously coming out of a somewhat classical style. There's actually columns in front here. This building here is profoundly unsymmetrical. It's marked by cuts and angles and light and voids. And when you sort of look at the building, what the interior spaces look like are like this, where different kinds of light come in and different parts of the building are accessible and other parts are inaccessible. In many ways, the building is itself a kind of memorial to a history that's been broken, that's been cut, right? And so if you look at the outside, you kind of can see these are the windows, right? They're kind of incomplete. And inside, what it has is this effect of allowing light in, shadows, kind of as the sun, moves, you're going to have different kind of light and shadows. You could imagine curating an exhibition in this space would be very challenging, not only because the lighting is strange, but also because of the size, the rooms, the angles, all of these things. You can also kind of get a sense here of a Jewish star that's kind of been broken apart, a little bit fractured. And this is one of the symbolic parts of the building, was he took a Star of David and really took those angles of a Star of David and broke it. Kind of started putting lines through it. Started actually taking a star as a symbol and then cutting it into pieces, and then taking those pieces and transferring it into an architectural style to create these fractured windows, right? And then you get spaces, very interesting spaces that look like this, sometimes ones that are completely inaccessible. He purposely built voids into the museum, places that you actually can't go. You can look in, but you can't actually go there. In this case, you can sort of go into the room, but you would then be walking on this memorial, which consists of metal plates. There's thousands of these metal plates. You can kind of see their faces, eyes, nose, mouth. They're metal cutouts, and they're all across the floor. And there's thousands and thousands of them, obviously invoking an idea of great loss, pain, suffering, and again, an interesting moment of using the body, right, the face. But it's not just, it's not any particular face, it's just faces. In some ways, they're nameless faces. They're anonymous faces. But they're people, or they represent people, or they point to people, and they're just laying on the ground. This is on the ground floor. So you can sort of see the way the museum operates in a lot of different ways, as a memorial, as a commemorative space, as a site of evocation of Holocaust memory, and then as a kind of complex, almost precarious relationship between German and Jewish, right? A kind of, interweaving. Has anyone been there? Just kind of curious. Some of you saw Eisenman's memorial. Have anyone seen the Jewish Museum? No? A couple of you? Yeah. Did you, what was your impression? I just asked real quick. Like it? Dislike it? Found it odd? Medium.
Yeah, it's radio, like the space is really bad.
What is this?
I felt it was very basic, what is Jewish, what the Jewish people do, and what is the sin, instead of got here and
The exhibition itself, I would say something about that. The exhibition is in some ways kind of disappointing. I visited this museum in 2000 when it was empty, and I thought the structure was stunning. I mean, you actually went through the entire museum, and there was no exhibition. And I found it entirely effective in its emptiness. But once they put the exhibition in there, which was this kind of chronological exhibition of, here's, Jewish ritual practices, and here's a menorah, and here's a, Hebrew Bible, and here's a synagogue, suddenly you start to find it almost became kind of kitschy. It became kind of like, Like it just be simplistic in some ways. And it was, to me, this is my personal opinion, but I think it accords with what your impression was, it was almost at odds with the significance of the structure itself and what the structure was doing commemoratively. The exhibition was almost like an afterthought. And in this regard, I found that kind of striking and in some ways disappointing. But as a building, it's really quite an amazing achievement. So I'm going to now turn to the last memorial that I want to talk about. It's not a building at all, but actually a bunch of signs. And I realized some of them, yeah, they're all in German here, but some of them are visible. So this is a memorial in what's called the Bavarian Quarter in Berlin. It's a part of Berlin that's in the west. And what it consists of are a bunch of little signs on light posts. And these signs have, in German, they have laws that were created by the Nazis. And then on the other side, it has some kind of like a little, almost like a childlike insignia that symbolizes something about the law. So, for example, these are the artists. I'll come back to them. For example, like on the light post, it'll say here, Jews may no longer have pets. February 15th, 1942. And so the law is hung on the light post in this little part of the city. Some other examples, 1936 as well, Jews cannot be veterinarians. 1939, Jews can't have jobs, period. This one is, Jews can only sit on the yellow benches in Bavarian Plaza. And so all these laws, and if you remember in the class, going back to the first days when I talked about the rise of fascism, I talked about the extraordinary number of laws that were put into place by the Nazis. In fact, over 400 laws specifically targeting Jews. And so almost every one of these laws has the word Jew or Jewish in it because the Nazis put that into law. Jews can't do this, Jews can't do that, Jews can't be out past 9 o'clock, Jews can't buy milk, Jews can't do this, and so forth. Now, of course, there were other laws targeting other groups. We know there are laws, as I mentioned, homosexuals, Sinti and Roma. Proportionately, those number as several, maybe 5, maybe 10. 400 laws targeting a particular minority is extraordinary. And so the idea was to put all these laws up in a public plaza so that people could see them. Now, you could imagine this is kind of disconcerting. And so here's the artist, really extraordinary collaboration between Renate Stich and Frieder Schnock. And it's kind of their conceptual artists in some ways, in that they have a concept, and they then implement that concept in a space. In this case, the concept is, let's remember the history of fascism through the laws the Nazis created, and to do so in a public space where people every day who are just walking around, walking their dogs, sitting down on the bench, they might look up and say, oh my God, I'm sitting on a bench now, here in 2017, and if I shift back, 70 years, Jews are not allowed to sit on, this bench. And so it's this interesting kind of disjunction of almost the everyday, right? So the sign, for example, that says Jews can't buy milk, it's across from a grocery store. The sign about the benches is next to a bench. And so it's almost like it takes you out of your everyday. It's like the safety of me here in the present, and I go, whoa, just shift back in time, and suddenly all these laws. And so they have a little map, and then on this map it shows you where all these laws are, and they're all displayed in, as you can see, sort of in spaces. I have a couple in English so you can read them, and I'll kind of just say a few of them because they're so kind of, in some ways they're so everyday. Jews are all expelled from singing groups. Jews can't receive academic degrees. Jews can't have animals. When the Olympics comes to Berlin, we have to get rid of all the anti-Jewish signs. Let's see, towards the top there, Jews can't have telephones. Jews can't have knives. Jews can't be midwives. Jews can't swim at the Wannsee, which is a lake. You know the Wannsee because also where they had a conference in 1942. They had a law in the 1930s. Extraordinary, and you can imagine, a very effective memorial. But just think about it in terms of, think of Eisenman's memorial, how big it is, how grand, the concrete, the columns. And, you're meant to experience that. This memorial is so much more subtle. right? It's so much, almost quieter. It's almost every day. You know, if you're not looking up, you might not even see it, but yet they're a little higher than eye length, so you know, you'll see them. But you're walking your dog and suddenly you run into this, you know, law that says Jews can't buy milk. And it sort of is shocking in some regard, especially when you're walking around the neighborhood and there's hundreds of them scattered around. In some ways, I find this actually to be a much more effective memorial than Eisenman's. As great as Eisenman's is in terms of producing that sense of vertigo, this one has another effect on me, which is it produces that connection between past and present almost in a kind of way that I stumble upon it. It's almost unpredictable. I need to make a trip to Eisenman's memorial. I go there. I'm like, I'm in the memorial. Here it is. Here, I'm just walking my dog. You know, I'm just getting groceries. So I'm just sitting on the bench, and suddenly I'm confronted, not in a really aggressive way, but in a kind of subtle way, with a memory, right, with a law. And in that regard, you know, the memorial is extraordinarily, I think, effective. Thoughts or questions about this one? Hmm? Hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. This one catches you off guard, yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Okay, you could argue that. Yeah, you could argue that in some ways this one maybe is a little bit more aggressive because it catches you off guard, right? You're like, I'm just going to get groceries, and yet you're reminded of this. Yeah. Uh-huh. That's right. That's right. I think that's a really good point. This memorial, in some ways, confronts you with a history that maybe you're not entirely prepared to confront at this moment. You know, when you go to that museum, it's like you got to find, Liebeskind's museum is not even centrally located in Berlin. You got to kind of make an effort to find it and get there. And the Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Memorial, although it is centrally located, you know, most people don't live right by it. Whereas people live in this neighborhood. This is a kind of, you know, it's just a normal middle-class neighborhood, and these signs are peppered all around. And so, in some regards, this has a different effect, is that it takes on, the laws take on this everyday quality. And granted, you can filter them out, you know. We have all kinds of mechanisms to cope with our world. We filter lots of things out, and you could do that. But in some ways, the difficulty of doing that is what's interesting about this monument, is that it kind of provokes. So let me tell you about lots of laws. I think I gave you on the PowerPoint a long time ago. This is just laws from 1938. You know, Jews can't be in public schools. Jews can't move. Jews can't have carrier pigeons. Jews can't have property. All passports by Jews are invalidated. Jews, you know, can't have guns. All these things. I mean, this is just 1 year of laws. And they don't have every law up there because there's like 400 of them, but they have a lot of them. They do have one law in particular, which I wanted to show you, which is actually this law right here, right there. And in German, what it says is, Achten deren Gegenstand antijüdische Tätigkeiten sind zu vernichten. And this is a law that came up in February of 1945. And if any of you speak German, you now know that this is the full law, which basically says that if it's not possible to remove documents that contain anti-Jewish activities, those documents are to be destroyed, vernichten, so that they don't fall into enemy hands. So this is the last law that the Nazis passed, technically, in February of 1945, which basically says if there are documents, if there's files, if there's evidence of doing anti-Jewish things, you, meaning the Nazis, are to destroy that evidence. So the last law was to destroy the evidence of the Holocaust, which is pretty extraordinary. And I also think it's extraordinary that law is also part of the memorial, which basically the memorial is undermining, right, the intentions of that law. The memorial is basically saying, I'm not going to destroy the evidence of this. I'm going to put all that evidence out there. And in that regard, it kind of takes a different charge, right? Because it's speaking directly against the intentions of the Nazis, which is not just to kill and destroy, but to destroy the history and memory of the acts. Like, can you imagine putting into law an act that destroys the history of what you're doing? Which is exactly the intention of the law. So the full law is like, if it's not possible to remove the documents, and in German that's Akten, so that means files, documents, papers, all these things, that contain anti-Jewish, basically contain evidence of anti-Jewish activities. If it's not possible to get rid of them, or to remove them, to like transport them somewhere, then you're to annihilate them, vernichten. Remember this word, right? This word is also the same word that Hitler used to talk about annihilating people. So now you're annihilating documents. You're making them into nothing. So he talked about vernichten, that's the intentionality to destroy people. Now they're talking about the intentionality to destroy the past. Amazing, right? So this is, to me, when I realized this law, the whole memorial took on a different charge. Because then it became clear that it was very much intended not to make this law come true. Okay, so a couple of other things I want to talk about today. That's like my reflections. Yeah, so this is it. I should say that this part of the lecture you're not responsible for in any sense of I'm not going to test you on my reflections. I'm just going to give you some reflections of some things that I've been thinking about. And, if you have comments, I certainly welcome them, as always. Maybe you can read that for a second, and I'll tell you about it. Yeah, so this is something I think about a lot. Maybe you think about it. It's like, why do you study the past? like we've been studying it for the whole class, right? And usually the answer is, we say, well, to learn the lessons, right? To not to repeat the past, not to repeat the mistakes. And I think that's good. Let's just say I think that's noble. I think that's a good reason. But what's striking to me is that the past never looks exactly the same. It's like we want to say, oh, it's just like, what the Nazis are doing. It's like, well, not quite. It's actually a lot of differences. But there's new context, there's new features. And so my feeling is we actually have to train ourselves to hear what I call echoes and reverberations that remind us of our knowledge of the past. Now, if we hear these echoes, what that means is we're sensitive to the lessons of the past and the knowledge of the past, but we don't hear it in exactly the same way. It's not going to look exactly the same. It's not like the Nazis are going to come to power again and start shipping off Jews to concentration camps. I don't think. But there are aspects of that knowledge that perhaps we can be sensitive to in the present. And so in this regard, I think that it's really about what do we do with the knowledge that we have and how do we apply it in the present. And this to me is kind of a notion of what some Holocaust historians call the practical past. And I say, what's practical past? Well, practical past means how is it practically applicable to your lives, right? How does it provide guidance? How does it provide an ethical compass? How does it provide a framework for action? Not because the past will look the same, but because there's something in the past and that knowledge that I have that I could then articulate in the present, practically. So, some reflections. While I'm teaching this class, I've never taught this class at this kind of a political moment, which is pretty interesting. And I know, many of you have asked me kind of off the record, it's like, so what do you think about, politics? What do you think about, what's going on in the US and so forth? And I hesitate to tell you because, the class is not political. And I'm not going to, this is not about indoctrination by any means. And I want you to think for yourself. At the same time, it would be hard-pressed if you didn't sometimes think about connections between our present moment. And I think there's our greatly. I don't mean just in the US, I mean globally. And what does it mean that we now have all this knowledge about the Holocaust and the history of fascism? One thing we can do with it is we can put it in a box. Right? We can say, look, it's the past. I studied it, I know it, I'm going to keep it over here. Another is that question of echoes and reverberations. And it's like it then means for us to be trained to have a sort of sensitivity to see things that remind us of our knowledge of the past. Not because Trump is Hitler. No, that's so facile, it's so reductive. Trump's not Hitler. There won't be another Hitler. Hitler is a unique historical figure. But are there things in the present that remind us of our knowledge of what happened in the past? And if there are, what do we do? And that, I think, is a really interesting and challenging question. It actually means that we have to have a lot of nuance, not to make facile equations, Trump is Hitler. At the same time, it also means for us to say, maybe there are some things in the past that apply today, and we need to be sensitive to those things. So it's not just past. So these are what I think. These are my kind of like 7 things of what I kind of gained from the class as I thought about it this quarter. First is resistance. I think resistance can mean a lot of things. And this is actually really interesting to me. And I think it can mean big and small things. It can mean that you're prepared to risk everything, like your professional career, your life, right? It could also mean that you do very small things, like giving someone, I don't know, giving them $1. Giving them, Zenon talked about someone who one night gave him a piece of bread, and that helped him to get through the night. A tiny little element of resistance. And the question is, what everyday forms can resistance take? Because those are the forms that I think immediately you and I can do. We don't have to be risking our lives necessarily, but perhaps we will. Perhaps. I think for me, resistance is based on a particular value, and that value is advocating for the dignity of all human beings. So if I feel that the dignity of some human beings is being violated, that would be the basis of a kind of resistance. Certainly one of the lessons from this class is treating people as a whole, as a group, is a problem. Right? All Jews are this. I mean, every single law that we just studied was about grouping people together as a whole. That all these laws apply to them and therefore exclude them. All Chinese are this. All Jews are this. All Muslims are this. As soon as you do this, you're in a place where you've obviously destroyed individuality. And you're no longer judging people, but as groups. Going along with resistance, non-compliance is an interesting question for me. As I look back at the Italian police, why did the Jewish Italians in Rome survive? It's because the police didn't comply with the Nazis to round them up. Non-compliance. Did they pay a price? They didn't really pay a price. That is to say, the Nazis took care of it as best they could, but it turned out they needed the cooperation of the local authorities and the police in order to be successful. And when they didn't have that cooperation, they weren't successful. So non-compliance doesn't necessarily mean breaking the law. It might actually mean not obeying authority. And then I would also add that if you are going to comply, you don't have to be cruel. So, give you an example, something that bothered me a lot this quarter. When the travel ban was in place and you had ICE authorities arresting people in airports, why is a 5-year-old handcuffed? Why? He's Afghani. But we know that in JFK, you have a 5-year-old who was held for 20 hours away from his parents. Why the cruelty, right? So you can comply with the law if that's the law. And I would actually argue that this is a perfect example of civil disobedience if you don't want to apply it. But if you're going to comply, you don't have to do it in a way that's cruel. You don't have to deprive people of food, of a wheelchair. You don't have to handcuff a 60-year-old. You don't have to make them keep their handcuffs on when they go to the bathroom. All these things happened in JFK when the travel ban in late January was in place. So that's what I mean by compliance with the law doesn't have to be cruel. I think dissent is certainly democratic. I mean, certainly the possibilities of preserving dissent is absolutely critical. I don't think a bystander perspective is ever ethical. Can debate it, but I don't think looking away is ever an option. I think a bystander perspective always implicates you. And the question really is, in what ways are you implicated? And me, I kind of think of myself in the current situation as obviously I'm male, I'm white, I'm able-bodied, I'm enfranchised in a lot of ways right now in this particular moment where I'm not targeted. I'm not undocumented, I don't have dark skin, I am not, I'm fluent obviously in English, I'm highly educated, I'm very enfranchised. And so to me that produces an obligation of solidarity. That means that I have an obligation with regard to the power that I have to use it in a way where I recognize other people who are targeted because they don't have that same kind of power. Again, they're my reflections. You're not tested on them. I'm just telling you things that, the class meant to me. One of the really interesting, I suggest this book a lot. Timothy Schneider is a professor of Holocaust history at Yale. You can buy this book for $2.99 on Kindle. I think it's a really worthwhile investment. A little book. It's only 30 pages long. It's tiny. But he has some lessons, and the lessons are broad from the 20th century, which is on tyranny. And what's interesting about these lessons, they kind of accord with some of the things we've been talking about, which is think about obedience and what it means to acquiesce to authority. You don't have to obey from the beginning. No one's making you. That is to say, you can question the authority that is being kind of held over you. Certainly, I think I talked about this before, one of the key elements of fascism is always the elimination of checks and balances. Always, always. You have to have that elimination. And so here, I'm very wary of any attacks on the judiciary, any attacks on the courts. You have to, if the independence of the courts and their authority is called into question, you're on the road to fascism. There's no question. I think it kind of goes hand in hand with attacks on the independent media. If you don't have an independent media and free speech, you basically, again, you have this movement towards fascism. I think that when you have symbols of hate, and this is something Schneider talks about too, hate speech, hate crimes that go unchecked, unpunished, they turn into a violent new reality. I was just following orders, right? This is the mantra of every Nazi on trial. I was just following orders. I don't think, and Schneider doesn't think, it's no excuse for renouncing professional and personal ethics. Again, that issue of compliance comes right in here. He argues this, and I think this is a nice little phrase, post-truth is pre-fascism. As if you're in a world where there is nothing true anymore, or that anything goes, you're also in a world that can give rise to an entirely different kind of reality, a very violent one. So post-truth, pre-fascism, really interesting kind of way to phrase it. This I kind of alluded to in my lecture on fascism, but I want to point it out again because we don't know what the future is going to bring. We've had something horrible happen in the United States, obviously in the 21st century, 9/11. It gave rise to the Patriot Act. It gave rise to, surveillance. The Constitution was still in place, thankfully. But I think if something unthinkable was to happen again, like the Reichstag fire, like a 9/11, we at this moment have to defend the Constitution in the utmost. These crises are the ultimate test of our democracy. Because if the crisis becomes a ruse for suspending constitutional freedoms, that is the basis for the end of our democracy. And so, protect the Constitution if, when the unthinkable happens is, again, we don't know what the future holds, but we have to know that this is the moment, if any moment, where you defend the Constitution. You don't suspend it. I don't know, some of you may have heard of Stanley Milgram, who is also a guy from Yale. And in the 1960s, this is my penultimate slide or something, he conducted a number of experiments with students at Yale. Basically, they were studies of obedience. So basically, he had a student, who was asked to administer shocks, like electrical shocks, to someone who answered questions incorrectly. And so there would be on one side of a glass wall, you'd have someone sitting there connected to like a wire, and he would ask a series of questions, and they would say, yes, this question is correct, no shock. If he answered the question wrong, you had to administer a little shock. And at first it started off very small, 10 volts. You're like, 20 volts, 30 volts, 50 volts. And the idea was that Milgram basically was the position of authority and say, he answered this question wrong, you have to put the shock. And they're like, no, I can't administer a 100-volt shock to this guy. It's absurd. And yet it turned out that 65% of the people obeyed all the way to the end, delivering a 450-volt shock. It's enough to kill someone, right? Now, the reality is there was actually no shock actually being administered. What that person on the other side was doing was an actor. And they're like, I'm being shocked, I'm in pain. Now, this experiment probably wouldn't pass muster today because it would probably be, misleading. It would be problems with IRB and so forth. But what was interesting about this is he thought that people, when in a position of obeying authority, would obey authority. And they do so all the way to the end. So the fact that most people obeyed by delivering the shock indicated to him that they were willing to unquestioningly accept his authority and to proceed even if it meant potentially killing someone or at least thinking that they were killing someone. So he says the disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. This is exactly the same logic of every Nazi put on trial. I was obeying authority. I'm not personally responsible. Someone else is responsible. I'm just, marching in order. The Holocaust historian Christopher Browning, he studied one of the German police battalions, all composed of what he calls ordinary men, middle-class men, mainly in their 30s and 40s, with families. They carried out heinous crimes. Their general even asked them at different times, do you want to be excused from doing this? The vast majority said, no, I want to do it because I'm doing it for Germany. I'm doing it for my commander. I'm doing it out of authority. Not because I hate the Jews, not because I'm so bloodthirsty consumed with it, but because it's my duty. Striking. Again, it goes back to that issue of non-compliance. It's like you have the opportunity not to comply. That freedom is there. It's always there. Last two things I think I want to say. I'm involved actually in a court case right now, actually against Donald Trump. And I'm going to share this to you because I think it's interesting. I'm part of a group of professors who wrote about this particular executive order, which requires on a weekly basis to make public a comprehensive list of criminal actions committed by aliens. This executive order is very problematic, mainly because it has the result of stigmatizing immigrants and undocumented people in the United States by publishing criminal lists. Nazi Germany published criminal lists. You know this for Jews, for homosexuals, and for gypsies. They did so in a way in the 1930s that stigmatized these populations, that allowed for further legal actions to be taken that deprived them of their citizenship and eventually led to, in the 1940s, them being deported to camps. This court case is called an amicus brief, which basically means I don't have any standing per se to actually do anything other than be a friend of the court. I can provide, as a historian, examples, precedents, evidence. There's several historians from UCLA. In fact, Kelly Lytle Hernandez from the history department and Jeff Robinson as well from the history department are part of this amicus brief. It's being considered possibly tomorrow as to whether it would be accepted. And the idea is simply to say that, look, whenever you put together public criminal lists that target a unique group and a population, this has bad consequences and you shouldn't do it. Again, you're not tested on this. I'm just telling you this is a way that I've applied historical knowledge to the present.
Yeah, it's sort of unfair because it just shows you one piece of an entire picture. What if you put a list together of all the good things that legal aliens did for the community, or to use the problematic term, illegal aliens? I mean, you
Right.
see an entirely different picture.
Right, exactly. So that's exactly correct. So that's the basis of when one starts putting together lists of crimes, the result is stigmatization and targeting. And one could imagine the opposite. You could say, things that are good, so to speak. But of course, that's not what this is aimed at. So let me end this last slide, and I'm going to take you back to Spiegelman. This is my last thing I want to say. So I'm really good at reading this stuff historically. And, part of the whole class was, I'm going to read all this. Look, it happened in the 1930s and 1940s. Jews, Germans, Poles. We can read it like that. We can say this entire book is about Art Spiegelman's father, the experiences that he had in Poland, and the way in which he told the story, and Anya's story. And that's the argument I made in class, right? I said that. And if you remember this part, what's going on here is that Anya and Art are trying to pass as Polish here. They're wearing masks so that they're not mice, they're pigs now. They're looking for a place to hide because they're on the run. So thank God there are still some good people left, I thought. And then, a Jewess! There's a Jewess in the courtyard. Police! An old woman recognized Anya. Hurry, hurry! We ran as fast to the shed and hid in the straw. It's okay for now, so they're in hiding. I don't think anyone heard her. She's a little senile anyway. But you must look for a better place to stay. Someone here is bound to recognize you. It's almost morning here. I'm going to go outside and scout around. Be careful. I walked, but I didn't know where to go. And I found soon it was somebody following me, someone following behind me. So, it's a Jew, 1939, 1940, trying to pass as part of the majority, obviously being pursued not only by the police, but also being pursued by fellow citizens. The crime is they're guilty of their existence as a group. You're guilty. Your crime is nothing that you actually did wrong. You didn't actually rob anybody. You didn't murder anybody. Your crime is you're a Jew. Well, what's your crime today? You're undocumented. Your crime today is that you came into the United States illegally. Maybe you're Mexican. Maybe you speak other languages. Maybe you have brown skin. Maybe you're Muslim. There are other times where you have people being pursued for no other reason other than the fact that they are different or other. So to me, when I read this today, I don't read there's a Jewess. I read there's an undocumented. There's an undocumented in the courtyard. Police, ICE agents, come after them, get them out, route them. It's possible, and again, I'm not trying to make a kind of simplistic thing here. It's just, again, what does it mean? Do you hear any echo or reverberation of the past? That, to me, is the only reason you study the past, is because it's practical. Because there's something you not only learn from it, but that you apply. It's not the same. I know they're not Nazis in the United States. I know the ICE agents are not Nazis. I know that. Of course they're not, because the past doesn't repeat itself the same way. It's a question of, do I hear any echo? Do I hear any reverberation? Anything that reminds me of my knowledge of the past that I can apply right now? And to me, there's actually a lot of things that I hear that are echoes and reverberations. And again, that's where the question of resistance and non-compliance comes in. So, that's all I have to say. Thoughts?